Hey everyone.
I guess I should start. Intro music. Boom. Welcome to the Bench Ass Shirt podcast. This week I'm talking about bread. So feel free to exit now. No. We're going to talk about bread, but more importantly than that, did everybody get the drink? No.
I got something else, which I'll share when it's time to drink.
It's time to drink.
Okay.
I gotta say, tamarind is a flavor that I have absolutely zero head knowledge of. Like, there's nothing in my brain that knows what
Really?
tamarind tastes
so you-
like. I know it's been in some things that I've eaten, but
So you're not
it's not a
familiar with
flavor I've ever
tamarind?
isolated. No, that's why I found it
Oh
such a
my god.
strange.
So
and to
we
the
need
extent
the
I do know, it's
tamarind.
like a barbecue thing. You like put it on pork.
It's
I mean,
delicious.
it is
envy
delicious.
you.
Have you
Yeah.
had the pods, Danielle? Like you can actually get the pods and peel them open, and there's like the sticky goo inside, and there's seeds
I've
you gotta
had
watch out
candy.
for. But
I've had tamarind candy, but I haven't
How
had
about-
the actual pods
how
themselves.
about the
So what I
tamarindo
have
drink? It's like
is I have
Kool-Aid.
ginger,
Yeah.
lemon, and turmeric. So I have something that has a tea ingredient as well. It
Turmeric.
was as close as I could
Alright.
get.
All right.
See, again, now turmeric is a flavor I'm familiar with, but not one that I would put in a soda pop.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ben, you and I get to tamarind Jarrito hit up. Is it Jarrito or is it Jarrito?
It's Mexican. I assumed it's a Urito.
Jarrito? I don't know. Anyway, I only had a giant bottle. That's all they had.
Oh wow.
And so
I mean, the small bottle is not small. It's 750 milliliters.
yeah, this one is more than that, I think. But I brought a glass with ice this time. This time it's my turn to be classy. Ben was classy with his whatever that was.
Okay.
Boysenberry.
I'm gonna get a
not
curly
boysenberry.
Q straw next time.
Yeah.
What was it? Loganberry.
Okay.
What do you think, Ben?
I could get behind that. It is a flavor that is reminiscent of something, but I don't know what.
It reminds me of tea. So, I mean, Danielle, you're
Yes.
pretty close there with the tea. It reminds me of a tea.
It reminds me of, you're absolutely right, like an iced tea.
Yeah, almost like an Arizona iced tea or something. For what it's worth, if you get a chance to find tamarindo, it's like Kool-Aid, but it's like pre-sweetened powdered mix that you just mix with water and like make a 2-quart pitcher of it. That's really good as well. It's not carbonated. It has, I think, a stronger tamarind flavor.
Okay. I like that.
But this is good.
There's a little citrus to it. I don't know if that's native to the tamarind or if it's.
It is. It's pretty zingy, like the
Yeah.
actual fruit, or it's like a seed pod. I don't really know. I just like you
I mean, I've
scrape
got a
out
jar
the
of
goo.
paste in my cupboard. That
Yeah. So
learned immediately
and it's
used.
literally just the tamarind paste scraped out of the pod. And I mean, have you tried that out of the jar?
No, not yet. I haven't even opened it. I bought it for something
Okay.
I was gonna make, some pork dish I was gonna make, and I never made it.
I mean, you can probably like
We're
mix it with
trying.
water to make
Yeah.
a drink, but it's tasty. I really do like tamarind a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They used to make, and this is becoming a different kind of episode. They used to make Kool-Aid that was tamarind flavor. Like Kool-Aid had an actual
Really?
tamarind flavor, but it was discontinued years ago,
Oh.
and I can't even find it on my weird, like, aftermarket
your
black site.
your
you know.
Kool-Aid community.
Yeah, I can't even find it because I wanna try it, but I haven't been able to find any.
I let this be a
So-
note for those who don't know. If you're looking for black market discontinued Kool-Aid, Shawn's your plug.
Normally
It's
he
true.
is, but now I want to find this for you for a holiday. I haven't wanted anything more than that in a very long time.
So the secret when you are collecting Kool-Aid, like most people who are, I mean, there is a community of people who collect old Kool-Aid. I'm one of the few that drinks it. But my rule of thumb is if it still shakes, I'm fine drinking it. A lot of the old ones, though, the packets have lost their integrity, and so it like hardens, and there's like a chunk inside where like moisture got in there. I'm not going to drink that. That's messed up.
I would. Where's your sense
But
of
if it
adventure?
shakes,
Live a
I'll
little,
make
Shawn.
it and drink it. No, it's I don't know. I don't know what made it moist. Speaking of
You just
hydration,
ruined it.
Yeah. So how's yours, Danielle? Even though we don't have it to compare to.
So this is it's a probiotic soda. I'm realizing
Oh.
now, which is
The turmeric
interesting.
makes me think
Yeah,
that it was like had
yeah,
like a health angle.
it does. It's fizzy, zesty, tarty, spicy, and gutsy, and I think they
Wow.
nailed that. Yeah.
Wow. I think that Kool-Aid packets that no longer shake are also probiotic
Mm-hmm.
because there's some weird crap growing in
Mm-hmm.
there.
I gotta say, a few of those words I would have also used to describe you, Danielle.
But only a few.
We'll leave which ones up to the audience.
Mhm.
All right. So the story of why we're talking about bread.
Mhm.
During the pandemic, first of all, I just want to put this out there. I was baking sourdough before the pandemic, before it was cool. And then the pandemic happened and it became what everybody on earth did.
And you had to stop doing it because Shawn doesn't play that
Yeah,
way.
it's like it's no longer cool, right? No, it's like mainstream. Forget that.
Yeah, it's like when everyone starts listening to your favorite band, you're done.
Yeah,
Done.
exactly. But during that time, I was also baking other stuff, and I got when you dive into something like that, you end up with all kinds of things like bannetons and your bread lom, which is a razor blade on a stick, or I had a little disc lom, all these things. But
Can we actually go back? I was watching Ben to see if he understood what you were talking about. I didn't. What were the
I'm
things
sure
that
that
you also had?
I'm sure that bread knows. I'm sure that Ben knows what a banneton is, right? So a
Yeah, yeah.
banneton is like a basket. Generally, it has
Okay.
like a cloth liner, and it's so that the bread can proof and stay in the shape of a loaf. And then a bread lom. I'm sure you know what that is too, right, Ben?
Hmm.
I kind of described it too.
I
Razor
thought it
blade.
was LeMay. I'll be honest.
I'm pretty sure it's
Okay.
lom.
I believe you. I just it's one of these moments where I'm like, that's not how I was
It's
pronouncing it in my
spelled
head.
lame, but I think it's lom. Anyway,
I thought it
and
had the
that's
accent on the E.
yeah. I think it's lom, but we'll have to find out.
Okay,
And if
I believe you.
our two listeners, let us know if who's right.
Please
But
reach out. So you were prepared before
that's
the
how you cut it.
pandemic. You had all these things in your
It,
Yeah,
house
it,
already.
is, and it is exactly what Shawn described. It's a razor blade on a stick.
yeah. And
Hmm.
I also have one that is a razor blade inside a little uh, walnut disc that unscrews and it comes out, so it's like a round thing with the blade coming out. It's much easier to use. It's a
Cool.
great lom. I should have brought it. I could have had show and tell. I could show off my solid walnut bread lom. But anyway, so I had all these things, and then bread making got really popular, and I was doing doing things like we'll talk about during the episode, but a lot of nerdy stuff. And a former editor that I know that's a shock, right? An editor that I worked with before said, why don't you pitch a book, a bread making book to this tech company because it's pretty nerdy, right? I was like approaching it from a nerdy standpoint, and and the publisher said, we're interested. Yeah, give us summaries of all the chapter summaries. And so I did. I spent a lot of time and 26 chapters and summaries for every chapter. And then they said no, and probably because the market was saturated with bread books at that point.
Well,
I mean,
if I were a betting man, I'm betting Elton Brown got wind of it. And it was like a science book about baking. Shut that down.
it very well could be. Yeah, he's like, no, that's
Like
my
that's
angle,
my
buddy.
territory, buddy.
So you guys get the knowledge. I didn't want to do this without Ben and or Asher though, because I know that both of them have gotten the bread bug and
Well,
have made.
I was also baking bread, not sourdough, but I was baking bread pre-COVID. But then the pandemic hit, and I was like, "Oh, I'm making starter. I'm doing it."
Yeah, yeah, and it
'Cause I
was
do
and the
like bread, as you can, evidence
I
and the
just
thing
could
about
see.
and what made sourdough possible during the pandemic is sourdough is a lengthy process. You have to keep coming back to it throughout the day, and when you're home all day, that's much more possible. And so that's why my personal thought, that's why it became so popular during the pandemic.
Also, people were buying weird things like all the bread and toilet paper, and
Yeah, that's
you were like,
true.
my God, I could be months before I have bread again if I don't learn to make my own. I mean,
Even then,
this
people
was
would buy all the
first world
flour.
white people on the verge of a zombie apocalypse. We're like, I got to learn how to make sourdough.
There was a time. I mean, this is literally true. Ben and I were like, hey, I found a bag of King Arthur bread flour at the grocery store and I bought it.
To
I'm
find.
like, holy cow, I had to buy a 50-pound bag from webstaurant.com and pay like $50 shipping just to get any sort of bread flour at the time. It was insane. But also a lot of books came out. So anyway, yeah, the reason that I think sourdough is so popular is because it takes a lot of time, but that's not even close to the simplest way to make bread. I would argue it's one of the more complicated and I don't know that difficult is the word, but finicky, fussy, artisan, but also it can be complicated, right? It's easy to screw up sourdough. But I wanted to write this book about all the different kinds of bread because when you make sourdough, and Danielle, I don't know how much bread you've made or not made, but
I'm a consumer. I
all
receive
right.
bread. I have yet to really make it. I've made pizza dough. I mean, that's it.
Okay, and when you made pizza dough,
Mhm.
you used yeast, right? I mean,
Yes, I did.
and so that's usually these days, apart from pandemic times, we would use commercial yeast, which is the same thing, the same sort of thing that is in a sourdough starter, but it's been refined and bred and not genetically altered necessarily chemically, but over the multiple lifetimes, it's just been refined and refined and refined until the strain is like super duper active. Like if you buy commercial bread yeast, you can have your bread raised in like 20 minutes. And if you do it the quote unquote natural way with a sourdough starter, it takes hours and hours to do the same thing because the natural yeast in the air isn't nearly as active. And
Commercial yeast
so
is like the genetically augmented super soldiers in the future
exactly,
war.
yeah. In fact,
Just three of them show
it's
up and can annihilate a planet.
it's so active that you often have to add sugar to your dough to give it something to eat because like sourdough you don't. With sourdough it eats the gluten in your flour and that's how it does its thing, but the commercial yeast is so voracious that you often have to add sugar or it will kill itself because it doesn't have enough food. It'll like eat it all and then be dead. So yeah, it's crazy stuff, but it does make it easier because you can do things like add sugar. You can raise your bread in 20 minutes. That's why the majority of bread, again, before until the pandemic happened, is using commercial yeast, and it's pretty. I mean, it's fascinating the science of bread, but it's pretty easy to make when you just follow a recipe, right? You add the yeast and usually some water, some sugar, possibly just to get that yeast going, and you put it into the flour, mix it up, and then the science behind what's happening though is in the flour there's gluten depending on like what kind of flour. You can have different levels of gluten, but gluten is the stuff that makes bread chewy and or stretchy, but it takes a while for it to develop, and the yeast helps develop that because it breaks down some of the bonds that are in the flour. Sometimes just sitting can let that gluten kind of loosen up and get stretchy. You also need to manually knead it to stretch the gluten out. The more you knead it, the more developed the gluten gets. If you knead it a whole lot, it can get really tight and like make a solid ball. Whereas if you knead it slowly over time, it relaxes more. But it's this crazy science of how you do it. That's why generally, if you follow a recipe, it can be pretty consistent if you have commercial yeast because then all of the factors are very much known. If you do it this long, if you need it for this long, if you let it sit for this long, is going to happen. And that's where sourdough gets crazy because it's not consistent and you have to go a lot by feel. So the gluten, my example of gluten. So flour is what you make bread with. Flour is also what you would make a muffin with. Like a muffin in the store, and they're very different, right? I mean, a muffin crumbles, or or a cookie. Cookies crumble. I guess I should have used cookie. That would have been far more appropriate. Of a yeah. The difference between why a cookie crumbles and bread is chewy is gluten. Generally, when you're making pastries, it is with a low gluten flour, and you don't need the ever loving crap out of cookie dough because it's possible that your cookie would get a little tougher. So anyway.
So is it possible? I mean, I know people who have made bread with all-purpose flour, but is that like how problematic is that?
No,
Not a
that's
problem at
right.
all. Yeah, that's generally a lot of people do use all-purpose flour to make all things, thus its name. And what makes it the difference between it is the amount of gluten. So all-purpose flour is kind of right in the middle. It has enough gluten to make bread. It doesn't have so much gluten that it can't make cookies. If you get bread flour in the store, it just has more gluten, so it makes bread better. You could still make pastries with it. It would be fine. It might be a little tougher, but probably not even discernibly so, to be completely honest. But yeah, all-purpose flour really does usually work great for everything.
And
It's fine.
conversely, if you ever buy cake flour, that is low gluten flour.
Yeah, again, because it's designed specifically for pastries. So yeah, cake flour is like very low gluten. All-purpose is in the middle. Bread flour is, more, and then you get like high gluten flour, which is really ideal for bagels, and some people like it for pizza dough, because if you like really chewy pizza dough. So that's there. But I'm gonna run out of all my material because now I just want to talk about
Well,
what
and
I looked
I
up
may be
here.
jumping ahead, but I'm curious,
Yeah.
like how you organize the chapters. And so I don't know. Are we getting there? Okay. All right. I'm
No,
gonna
I
let you,
mean
I'm
no.
gonna let you go.
So I'll go through the book because I see we're only 10 minutes in, and I'm like, all right, I only have a couple things to talk about now.
Well,
Then I just want to go eat bread.
the pizza thing is interesting because one of the things I learned recently, I make a lot of pizza dough.
And I
Yeah,
don't, so
as
I'm
you can
glad that
tell.
you're here to like talk
Um,
about that too.
the like the Italian flours that you get, the Tipo 00 that everyone wants to make pizza dough out of, authentic Italian flours tend to be lower on the gluten
Yeah,
scale.
it's true. That's why I said some people. And the 00 flour is lower in gluten, and often it's more finely ground, but that isn't necessarily what the 00 means. It's a consistent. It's like very consistent and very exacting, in
Yeah.
that it's across the board. It's like
I think it also means something different if the people on the internet are to be believed, and I have no reason not to believe them. It means something different in the U.S. versus Italian. If you buy true Italian 00, it's denoting a little more specific and a little more precise what you're getting versus just something you grab off a grocery store shelf. Like the King Arthur makes a 00 now that you can buy
Mhm.
at most grocery stores.
And I think you are absolutely correct, because if you're in Italy, for example, you get 00 flour, but it would almost be like, okay, but what kind
Hmm.
of 00 flour do you want? Do you want, lower gluten, higher gluten, different. And they actually go by ash content, which confuses me a
I
little
know.
bit. They don't generally talk about gluten content. They talk about ash content. I don't understand that altogether,
And
but
there's some moisture absorption.
yeah,
It's a tough word to say. Rating on the side of it as well that I don't fully understand. So it's
yeah,
I'm gonna investigate ash content. And when
it
I
gets,
said earlier
yeah.
that I've made like pizza dough, and that's really none that you wouldn't be offended by, gentlemen. Like this is
Oh,
just my.
you underestimate the garbage that Ben and I will eat.
yeah. The man's not wrong. Also, for the record, it is ash content, not ash
Yeah.
content. See what I did there, Shawn?
No, I didn't.
That was your joke, man, from
Ash
weeks
content,
ago
not ash content.
on the Bench Ash Shirt podcast.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've had a long week apparently. I missed it all. Man, I need to sleep in a bread bed, yo.
Y'all.
The bread bed thing? It was an SNL
No.
skit. It was an SNL skit. Oprah. So you have to look up SNL skit bread bed. It's not worth looking up right now, but
So ash content of wheat varies from about 1.5 to about 2%, and the pure endosperm contains about 0.35 ash.
yeah.
Does
So
that full sentence make sense to either one of you?
it's a corollary to the gluten.
Okay.
They
Okay.
just it's corollary, but that's how they measure it as opposed to the actual gluten content. It's like I I, I think it's a ratio that is like a linear ratio, even, ash content and gluten content,
Okay.
but it's just they measure a different thing to get the same results in a flour. So yeah, it is what it is.
Delicious and educational.
And for the record, you can adjust, like Shawn was talking earlier about like getting that stretchy dough versus crumbly
Mhm.
pastry dough. the other stuff that you add into the mix will impact gluten development, right? It's
It's
not just
true.
like if this is your gluten flour, this is what your thing is going to turn out like.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Fats
things
and
you
things of
add,
that nature,
the
sugars will change that consistency a lot.
and the way you manipulate it, right? You can knead your way to more highly developed gluten, and you can there's so many things that you can adjust, and that's why it's such a as much an art as anything else, and it's pretty forgiving, right? I mean, you can be really pretentious about it, Ben. I mean, you can be pretty pretentious about it, but I don't know. I just wanted to call you out for something that you're not actually pretentious about. But although you do have the Dutch oven that like costs more than my car, right?
It costs that much money. It's a it's
I
a
mean,
little
yeah, I
listener
drive a
say for
crappy
the
car, but
record.
still,
Many people own it's a
many
widely.
people own it because not a single person can afford it. Yeah, we get it, Ben.
Also, just so we're being completely honest, I own two Dutch ovens.
Yeah,
It's
no,
the right
but
number. It's the correct number, as I keep
It's
telling
yeah.
people.
I have zero. I've never made bread in a Dutch oven. I don't
Really?
have a Dutch oven. Yeah, yeah. I'm all about free form, which is where you just put it in a lump on a piece of parchment in the oven. Yeah. I also have. I'll go through the thing real quick. So
Yeah.
the first bake is a very simple recipe in my book that was going to be. The
Yes.
part one is just the first bake. It's just to make bread because everybody wants bread, right? So it was a very simple recipe with like a packet of yeast, simple ingredients, simple instructions. Put it in a pan, and you have bread. And you eat it with butter while you read the rest of the book. Was basically the beginning.
Good
And then talk
chapter.
about, yeah, that was literally part one, chapter one. And then the second part was about talking about flour, basically some of what we talked about, but more in depth because it would have been a book about like what the wheat gluten is and like the different types of wheat. I mean, there's like hard wheat and softer wheat, and they have different wheat berries that have different characteristics. And in Europe, they tend to have, I don't remember because it's been a couple of years now since I did it, but Europe has their flour is generally made from a softer wheat berry than in the US. We have like a hard red wheat. I don't remember what it is, but so ours is generally different. Talk about that, and then yeast, water, salt. Why the yeast works, how it works, how salt like tempers it, slows it down so it doesn't go bonkers town. So that's why there's salt in bread. I mean, not just for flavor. It does add flavor to bread, but generally the salt also stops the yeast from going bonkers town and eating all the stuff and just like inflating your bread and then dying so that it won't inflate in the oven. Yeah, it just interject,
And
Ben. You don't need to raise your hand.
calling me coach. And also, by virtue of slowing that down, gives the gluten more time to develop. That's one of those things
Yeah,
people like to make. People like to cut the salt back in their diets, right? It's a thing that happens. But when you're making bread, you can cut it back too much, and you can impact your gluten development
yeah.
because if you're taking too much salt, so you need that salt in your bread.
And a lot of people, I think, with the idea like, oh, less salt, like, well, it's not going to make that big of a difference to the flavor if I just leave the salt out. And so they think it's just flavor, but it's not. You know, it's flavor, but it's also very important to the yeast and the rising and the measurements, especially if it's a, tried and true recipe. The amount is what it is for a reason, So I mean, it's not good to leave the salt out when you're making bread.
Well, salt and the yeast too, like, are in such small amounts that a small variation can make a big difference, right?
Yeah, 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 for sure, for sure. And the yeast, I mean, the yeast makes more of itself. I mean, that's what it's doing, right? It's yeast sex going on, and it's going crazy and
I'm glad
making
that you
more.
called
And
out that when you didn't just say making more of itself, but pointed out that we're talking about yeast sex. Thank you. I needed that.
yeah, there's a reason it's hot in the oven.
I always played Barry White for my yeast.
Oh, okay, okay.
You gotta set the mood.
Anyway, so then I talk about like why it does what it does, things like salt, and then tools and terms like the bread lam or lame. I think it's lam still though,
I
and like
believe you.
why you
I
might use
really
a
do.
loaf pan, why you might not use a loaf pan, what the difference there is because a loaf pan makes a very consistent shaped loaf, But a free form is like what you think of with sourdough. Sourdough is usually, the big round loaf or whatever.
Is it anything other than shape though? Like does the crust on the
But
outside
yeah,
change
I
with
mean,
pan or not pan?
you get more of a crust with free form. You get a crust with the bread pan, but I don't know. Most people don't like that crust as much. It's not as like tough on
Well,
the
it's kind of
outside.
steamed. It sort of gets steamed in a weird way because it's pressed right up against the
That's
edge of the
yeah,
pan.
and that's a later chapter too. Because I don't know when you make your freeform bread if you add water to the oven to steam it for the first half of the time. But there's so many variables, and that's why I wanted to make this book nerdy because there's so much nerdiness to it.
I do, Sean. But it turns out that you don't have to do that with the Dutch oven.
Oh yeah,
Ah,
that's
Just
so
saying.
that is literally that is the reason that a Dutch oven is so good for making bread though, is because it holds that steam in, whereas otherwise you don't have to, but to get that same effect you need to add steam to the oven for the first half of the
Or,
half or so.
buy a $20,000 bread oven that injects steam in for you.
Yeah, which
If
again,
you
that's
got
all it
20K
does, right?
laying
It
around,
just has
I'd say
water.
go for that.
Yeah. And then the probably the nerdiest part of the book was going to be recipe management. I was going to show how to use Git to do versioning of recipes because during the pandemic in particular, making adjustments to bread were this is okay. So this is the actual chapter summary thing here. Bread recipes, especially artisan bread recipes, are made to be tweaked and changed as skills and desires change. Technologists can use the same tools we use for version controlling our code in order to maintain our recipes. In fact, GitHub is a perfect place to store recipes. Look at some of the simple markdown language and real-time compilation to see and share our living and changing recipes. Yeah, sure, my latest sourdough is great, but did you ever try release 3.1?
Yeah, that's a good idea. And it also makes me want to make a bread recipe Jenkins build pipeline.
Okay, this is I swear to you, this is true. The
keep reading,
first part
keep
of the
reading.
pitch, oh, it didn't say it wasn't Jenkins, but I said, oddly, the market for my book is the same as the market for a Python programming book. The only difference is that the end result is delicious bread instead of a cross-platform application. I want people who write their recipes in Markdown to keep them on GitHub and share them via Jekyll rendered HTML.
Yes.
I cannot believe this book didn't get made. I mean, this is.
And it's
I'll
still
tell you
marked up,
why,
isn't it?
and it's because you're too nice and you're not cynical enough. But the line there was the only difference is at the end you have something delicious instead of yet another to-do list that no one's ever going to use.
Well, it was too. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to market it to a company that literally probably has 20 Python books,
Yeah,
insulting the entire. Anyway,
they can handle it. If you use Python, you
yeah,
can handle it.
that's right. And so then
I said
part
it as
three
a
was
Python developer.
part three was yeast breads, where I talk about yeast breads, and some of this seems different, but feeding it, feed on flour and gluten, but you often add sugar. Adding fat to the frenzy, since yeast bread rises so quickly, there's often not enough time for the gluten to develop strength. Fat, along with salt, but fat can slow the growth of the yeast, but it can also add strength and pliability to the final product. And so there's often oil in like pizza dough. Not always, but often there's oil in pizza dough. But due to the way the gluten forms, the timing for adding the oil or butter, butter is oil obviously, can drastically change the characteristics of the dough. So sometimes you add it at a different time during the dough making process because if you add it too early, it might never form like you want it to, et cetera, et cetera. Then I talk about the different kinds of fermentation. Bulk fermentation is the first thing you do. Let it sit for a long time, depending on what you're making, and then you probably heard the term like punch it down, where you basically deflate it. Yeah, deflate it. Give it a few like you knead it a little bit just to get it all like squish all that carbon dioxide out from all the yeast sex.
I've seen the Great
And
British Baking Show.
okay, all right. So punch it down. That's the bulk fermentation, and then the proofing is the second, and that's where it's slower than at first because it's
Why is
already
it called
eaten a lot of the
proofing?
food. I don't remember. You should read the book that I haven't written yet. I'm sure it'll be in there. And then that adds the air, like it rises and gets more consistent, smaller air bubbles so that you have, your bread actually rises and is like airy inside and fluffy. And then I end that section with making a simple focaccia, which I think I said right, but it's like a simple bread. Focaccia?
So
I don't
again,
even
I'm
know.
going to disagree. I'm going to go with focaccia.
Gotcha.
But
Okay, I was not confident on that one at all. So um,
all
I
right, so
still
we're
think it's
one
a
and
bread
one.
lamb, but focaccia, that's yeah. But that was the how I was ending the yeast bread section rather than just make a loaf of bread because we did that at first, right? The first part was just making a simple loaf of bread. So this was making that, and then quick breads. Do you know what quick breads are?
No.
So
Make them all
if
the time.
you make a birthday cake, you don't put yeast in it,
Correct.
and but it still needs to be fluffy. And same thing
Yes.
with like pancakes. Pancakes are a quick bread. There's no yeast in pancakes
I
either.
don't want to think about a cake like bread, though. I want to think about them differently.
Banana
Well,
bread,
Okay.
yep. There you go. Thank you, Ben, for making it more.
which is really just banana cake. I mean, who are we
Yeah, it
fooling,
really
right?
is.
Like
It
it's
It,
is.
not.
it's
Yeah.
cake in a loaf, right?
I want to love them differently.
But what happens there is you don't get the complexities of the yeast, and you don't want to develop the gluten. And yeast helps develop the gluten. You don't
Mm.
want that because you want it to be crumbly and stuff. And so it's chemistry. It's basically a baking soda volcano that happens using things like baking powder and milk has lactic acid in it. Whatever ingredients you put together generally make bubbles, which is why if you're making any like pancake batter or waffle batter or cake batter, they generally tell you not to over stir it. The instructions will say like stir even if it's a little lumpy, it's fine. Like I mean that'll literally say that. And the reason is if you keep stirring and stirring and stirring, the reaction is going to be done. You're going to stir the bubbles out and then you have just flatness because you need to mix it, stir it up enough just so that it's combined, but not like over stir it and get
Mm.
it in the pan so that it can rise in the oven and do that little tiny baking soda vinegar volcano in the oven. But yeah, if you overmix it, you're going to lose that whole thing. So that's what a quick bread is. That's why it doesn't use
Okay.
yeast. It rises using chemical reactions. Yeah, and so it is banana bread, cake, muffins, all those things. But you can make. Have you ever made Irish soda bread, Ben? Okay,
One time,
so
they
yeah,
sell great Irish soda bread at Wegmans, so I always buy it there.
okay.
But
And Irish soda bread is bread. I mean, it's a savory bread, but it doesn't have yeast. It's made with soda, and that's how it gets its aeration
baking
is,
soda, for the
yeah,
record, not
baking soda.
not Pepsi,
Well,
not flavored Pepsi.
oh, that's true. See, I'm from the north. It's pop.
So am I, but I'm a man of the world,
Yeah,
citizen of the world.
and baking soda generally use baking powder, which is baking soda and other things that make it, that add to it. So baking powder is just baking soda and other stuff that adds some acid, and so when they get wet, they bubble. Yeah. And so yeah, that was quick bread, and then the end of that section was going to be making a loaf of Irish soda bread, which turns out better than you would think. Like for some reason, without any uh, yeast or very much gluten development, it just seems like it wouldn't be great. But it's surprisingly good bread. And
Yes, I'm a fan.
yeah, you've had Irish soda bread, even if you haven't
No,
made it.
my sister, Irish soda bread, she handles that. Her focaccia, by the way, is one of my favorite things. Like warm, just out of the oven, tons of garlic and butter on top of it. There's homemade bread is just amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And so
thank you
yeah,
for educating us further on all the other bread options.
yeah. But
Yeah, but
Irish
yeah,
soda
soda
bread is
bread's great.
something that's
Yeah.
fascinating to me. I didn't realize the significance of Irish soda bread. To be quite honest, I thought it was like bread and that there's soda in it, but I didn't realize the significance of it until I started making bread more regularly. That there's no yeast. It's literally just yeah. So that's cool. And then the next part was all about sourdough, because here's the thing about sourdough: it is still yeast, but since it's wild yeast, it's much slower because they're not those super soldier bread, you know, yeast things. They're whatever is existing in the air. And it also has bacteria in it, you know, in the air, and that's what the sour smell and flavor and stuff comes from, is bacteria. So a sourdough bread has both yeast and bacteria that are doing their things to ferment the dough. You have to feed your starter all the time. You have to feed it every day to keep it healthy, to make sure that the bacteria and the yeast are in balance, to keep away mold and all that kind of stuff. So it can be strenuous. You can also keep it in the fridge, so it's not quite as difficult to feed regularly, but then you have to like wake it up before you bake, and yeah, it's complicated. But that's how bread was made. I mean, it didn't used to be it didn't used to be like different, like, oh, this is sourdough bread. I mean, back in the,
It was just
before
bread.
the commercial bakeries or whatever, it was bread. I mean, that's, every bakery would have a starter because that's how you made bread rise. There wasn't commercially made yeast that was like super soldiers. That's just how you made bread. And so it's a very old way of making bread. And yeah, again, you still generally put a little bit of salt in it, but in my opinion, it's more for flavor in that regard, with sourdough, because it's such a slow process. Bulk fermentation takes hours instead of 20 or 30 minutes, and it's
When
just
I
a
was
slow
doing
day
it,
long
like
process.
my sourdough would sit on the countertop for 12 hours, like at room temperature for 12 hours,
And
which was crazy to
that's
me the
another
first
thing
time I read
too.
that. I'm like, you can't leave it sitting on the counter for 12. Yes, you can, and you did.
Yeah, yeah, and I would yeah, I even got a warming mat. So if you plant seedlings like early in the spring, you can get like a tiny little mat to put underneath the seed things to keep it like a couple degrees warmer. I got one of those that I would put my bulk fermentation vessel on, just to raise its temperature a little bit in the kitchen, because our house is kind of cold and drafty. And that would, it would still take hours. I mean, it still, it takes hours, but there's so many more variables too. You can ferment it overnight in the fridge, and just have it go for like a day or two in the fridge, and it just goes even slower because the temperature will slow. Like if it's colder, it goes even slower. And some people think that develops even more flavor.
It
But
does.
see, I mean, there's so many
Right.
things you can change.
Early on, you were saying that part of like being home lent itself to sourdough bread because you had to
Yes.
check on it all the time. So what were you
Yes.
checking on it to do? Because you guys are talking about it now, like it sort of could sit, you could be a set and forget, is what I'm hearing. Like, what is it
Well,
that you would sort of check in
set and
on?
for if you have to let it sit for 3 hours
Mhm.
and then come back and punch it down, knead it a little bit. Usually every few hours you would like knead it, at least, one of the ways you can do it is knead it every few hours, but you have to be home every few
Okay.
hours if you do it that way. Or
Mhm.
if you let it sit 12 hours, that's fine, but that's not the end, right? After that 12 hours of just bulk fermenting, then you still need to, knead it and form it. And you might have to put it in the fridge. My most successful sourdough is when, at the end, I would form it into a dough ball, put it in the banneton in the little basket, and put it in the fridge for an hour or so to get it nice and cool. And then I could cut the top, so that the reason you cut the top isn't just for fancy looks, even though it looks pretty and you often slice it and it looks all fancy. It's because if you don't do that, when you form the dough and the outside is nice and tight, like it's a nice tight ball or whatever, when it expands, you'll have a blowout. It'll
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
blow out the sides. So when you cut it, you actually give it room to expand, like, and it'll expand. Those slots, those slices will open up and expand. But yeah, that's why it's so crazy. And then, I mean, as if all these things aren't enough, hydration. Oh my goodness. Start talking about hydration with sourdough bread makers, and you get the people who are like, I use 100% hydration. And somebody will say, I use 70% hydration. Oh, I make 120% hydration. And yeah, it's very wet
It's
dough,
soup.
but it makes so good. Yeah, it's
The
of all
same the
the,
same
yeah,
conversation happens in the pizza dough community as well about the
I believe
correct
that.
proper
I do
hydration
believe that.
level.
And it's, since there's not a proper hydration level, everybody thinks theirs is the proper.
Yeah.
It's just so crazy. And then when the pandemic happened, it almost became this like, the higher hydration you could make bread successfully, the better baker you were.
So if you don't
And
have a steam room in your house, how do you hydrate it? Are you like
just how
submerging
much
it? What do you
water
do?
you add to the flour, like
Okay.
how gooky
Right.
dough is.
Hydration is just a measure of the percentage of water as a percentage of the flour
Okay.
in the
Yeah.
bread.
Yeah. And so
So yeah, and the
I
higher you get, the more sticky and kind of difficult to work with it gets. So if you
how
got
do you
like an
make it into
85% hydration dough ball, it's nearly impossible to handle. But people have all these techniques for getting it off their
yeah,
fingers and rolling it and
get it off their
shaping it.
fingers and roll it, and how do you make it not go "Bleh" on the
Right, when you
pan?
set
And
it on something, just ooze
yeah,
out.
how do and yeah, again, I mean,
Goes back to
it
the
became
gluten
this
and forming that tight
religion thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
ball.
yeah, and you kind of like roll it and you scooch it and roll it and scooch it, and like that top outside gets tighter and tighter and tighter. But it's just
Yeah.
it got to be a little bit silly in the online community during the pandemic. I think people got way too pretentious about their sourdough. But
I
anyway,
picked
yeah,
up from your wife's bookstore that book, the famous bread book, which I'm drawing a blank on the author's name
is it
now,
like
but
flour, salt, yeast, or whatever?
yeah, salt water, flour, yeast, or whatever,
Yeah.
something like that. It's not up there.
Yep. Asher
Um,
actually bought me that book.
yeah, and that's his approach. I like for the most part. He's like he's here's a amazing bread you can make, all-purpose flour. You start it at 7 o'clock at night. You bake it at 10 a.m. the next morning, and you have great bread in an hour, right? Like it's simple, straightforward, bing bang boom. He doesn't bother slicing. He actually has you load it so that the seam where you folded it up ultimately ends up on top, and so that's where the cracks and the blowouts kind of happen naturally.
Okay.
So it doesn't look like a fancy, cool, flower pattern on the top, but it doesn't
Yeah.
like blow out one side. It just splits on those natural seams from where you were doing your rolls and your folds. I
Yeah.
like that a
Cool.
lot better.
And it's funny. I have to admit, I didn't read the book, but that's why I wanted to start my book with a very simple way to make bread that is delicious. Like it doesn't have to be complicated. Like this is a whole book about bread, but it doesn't. You don't have to read it in order to make really good bread. If you read chapter 1, you can make good bread. It's just follow the recipe. And so then I just talk about loaf pans, Dutch ovens, parchment. Why you want parchment,
Bannetons.
bannetons. Yeah, yeah,
I do
and
have two
then
bannetons.
and then
What is a Benetton? Besides a
I wish you can
that's
look it up,
multicultural
but
ad.
it's usually it's like a wicker
yeah,
basket
and it
with these
often
big
has
thick
a
wickers.
and it
Was this the
often
same
has
you
a
were talking
cloth
about before?
insert.
And I just,
Yeah,
it's because
yeah,
okay.
yeah. I have oval bannetons and also a round one, and they almost always have like a cloth like linen like insert that kind of
Hmm.
goes in them. And you flour them really heavily, often with rice flour instead of wheat flour to flour the banneton. That's like
Gentlemen,
a
can you
pro
spell it
move.
for me? Because all that's coming back is like Benetton clothing. And so
No, no,
I
that's what
realize
it
I'm
is. That's what we're
hearing it
talking
wrong.
about.
Bannetten or something like that, or
I think
on. I
ON.
don't know.
Proofing basket. Okay, thank you. I
Yeah,
think yeah,
there you go.
perfect.
And then I talk about controlling the expansion, the scoring. How to so it doesn't blow out the side. And then heat and steam, adding steam or using a Dutch oven. And then the last bit of the book was going to be just tweaks and hacks, flour variations, like the different kinds of flour, like we talked about before I started talking about the book. And then specialty breads, like an enriched dough. So, like sandwich bread that you buy in the store to make sandwiches is barely bread at all. It's almost like an unsweet cake. But
I
in
love
order
it.
to make like a sandwich bread, like a sandwich style bread with like very tiny microscopic holes so that it like holds onto stuff and it doesn't fall through holes and stuff, we'll often have milk and butter, even eggs in it, as a binder. And so that's just an enriched dough. You enrich it with like eggs and milk and butter, all
A,
that sort of thing.
a dough without that stuff they call a lean dough.
Oh, okay.
LEAN.
Yeah, so you basically you can
Lord knows where I would have wound up searching for that. So thank you.
and then I did have a chapter on gluten-free baking, which is just why bother?
Right.
I mean,
Vegetables exist.
yeah. I mean, if you can't have
My heart,
gluten,
my
don't
heart pours
have
out to
bread.
people who are gluten
Yeah,
allergic.
agreed.
But
I
just
agree.
I get gluten-free pizza dough because I can understand. Like, I guess you still want the pizza. Like, no, and I'm not intolerant, but
I
I can
understand
understand
why.
trying really hard. That's what I
I
mean. I
understand
just
why
like
it
I can,
exists, gluten-free
yeah.
baking, but it's just sad. And then the last chapter of my book was the wonderful world of butter. I devoted an entire chapter to butter because
What a good book.
butter is just amazing. Butter is wonderful.
This is, and I distinctly recall this conversation when I reached out to Shawn once early pandemic, and I was like, you know what? The quality of the butter matters. I didn't realize that, and Shawn was like, yeah, it does.
Yeah. Like if you get and oh, I mean there's a whole chapter on it, but there's like if you get some of the fancy butter like in the butter section, like the stuff that's like smaller than a normal thing of butter and like 3 times as expensive, it often is what's the word I'm looking for? It's cultured. You know, it'll have, like cultured butter like actually has more flavor even than regular butter, and salted
That's
and
because
unsalted butter
it saw
matters.
some operas, right? And it spent some time in art
Yeah,
museums.
yeah.
It really just
It
absorbed a
comes
lot of
with a
that.
monocle. You know, I mean, you don't eat the monocle. It's just for
So I think of
and
Kerrygold as good butter. Is that like
yeah,
so
Kerrygold is
that's
really good butter.
That's
um
high end butter for
Yeah,
sure.
okay.
it is.
I'm wondering because I actually got my sister like blocks and blocks of Kerrygold butter as part of her Christmas present last year, just so she could cook with and use good butter for as long as
Yeah.
she wanted.
It's
If there was any
and see,
recommendations in that chapter for even better butter, I'll take that.
Betty Botta bought
Amish
some
butter.
butter, but she
Betty,
said this butter's bitter. If she puts it in her batter, it will make her batter bitter. So Betty Botta bought a bit of better butter to put into her bitter batter to make her bitter batter better. Thank you very much.
How's that for culture?
Yeah.
That was
I mean,
impressive,
Kerrygold is really
Shawn.
good butter. I don't normally use the fancy butters like that for cooking. I generally use those for putting on stuff and eating.
Yeah, I agree. Although I mean, even when I'm cooking, I still have like Land O'Lakes or whatever in the fridge. Once I
Yeah, I
started
still.
tasting the butter, I just stopped buying the grocery store brand butter altogether.
Although my grocery store, like Meyer, you know, it's a Michigan store, but
Hmm.
Meyer butter is shockingly good. It is a really good quality butter that they have. But not all butter's the same. I mean, Ben actually hit the nail right on the head. Yeah, some butter just sucks.
all I want for
It's
dinner
just like
tonight is a
waxy
big
or
loaf of
something.
bread and butter. Like that's all that I want for dinner now.
Yeah, and I encourage you to do that and get good butter to put it spread on top. Like the best
Yeah.
butters, like the cultured butters, that's
Looking.
so good for spreading on top so that you just taste the butter directly.
The Kerrygold is great.
It
The
is.
Amish butter, like around here, you can get rolls of Amish butter. It comes in a big tube shape,
That's
and
usually pretty good too.
that's
Yeah.
usually really good butter.
And if it's going to be something, you want it to be, there's a personal opinion too, but if you're going to spread it on something, you want it to be salted. You know, if
Oh
you're
yeah.
going to bake with it, it depends on what you're cooking.
You
It
don't
can be
know how
salted or
much
not,
salt
but
I put on top of it anyway. I am not
fair,
trying to reduce my cholesterol.
fair. But I
Hey,
mean, salted butter tastes
totally
better.
unrelated, but
Yeah.
segue from that. Buy that what is that brand? The Maldon sea salts, you know, that come in like the big square chunks, and sprinkle that on like your toast, your avocado toast. Ooh, Nelly, crunchy salt.
I don't
It's
think I've ever
awesome.
seen that in the store.
That's
Yeah.
great.
I think I would check it out in the baking section. It comes in a little box. It's called Maldon, Maldon,
Okay.
and it's the salt crystals are huge.
All
I mean,
right.
huge for salt
I have to
crystals.
do that. Yeah, yeah. I'll have to check into that. But yeah,
And you
so
get these.
that was the book.
Sign me up.
And
I'll buy it.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm in.
I might still write it. And the thing is, if I write a book, it's gonna be like it's not just a recipe book. I don't want to make a recipe book.
Right.
You
It's
know,
got
it
to
has
teach
like
people things.
yeah, it's more of a it's the story of bread.
The story of bread. Maybe you can
And
get David Attenborough to narrate.
I don't know why you wouldn't.
The yeasts are in a romantic mood. It is mating season in the bread bowl.
Yep. No, you have a winner on your hands.
Oh, now I think I know why the book wasn't ever published.
Look, just remember the takeaway for anyone who listens to this should remember that bread is 50% yeast farts. That's just what it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You got to get on board with that. You got to be okay with that.
That's where the flavor comes from.
Gosh.
Oh man. So yeah, that's that. Thank you for participating because that I really do miss making bread. I tried to make a starter again, like start up another starter,
Hmm.
Yeah.
and I can't get it to get healthy. I don't know what the deal is. I don't know if
Man,
my
I'll tell
flour is
you,
old
did you
or
get into
what.
Polish and Biga at all?
No, no, and I have regular yeast. I have like the really high
Yeah.
quality instant yeast, and it's in my freezer, so I'm sure it's still fine. And I could make bread, but I couldn't get a starter going, which is just weird.
I
Like
mean, you don't have to get it going. You just set it on the counter and walk away.
yeah, and then feed it every day, but it never got to the point where it was healthy. Like it was just have you started one from scratch, like with just flour
Hmm.
and water, Ben? Okay, I did too, and I mean it takes about a week usually, and
Yeah.
then it's good. I did everything I was
Your
supposed to for as
your
long
house is a
as
sterile
no,
environment.
I mean it was bubbly and frothy, but like usually the first half of the week it's kind of too vinegary smelling, and
Mm,
it's like you don't want to make anything with this yet. But after about a week, it gets that nice kind of fresh sort of healthy starter vibe, and mine didn't. I was going for like 3 weeks straight, just every day trying to
check out
get it
the
going.
he has a good kind of pretty detailed starter kickoff recipe in that flour water salt
Yeah,
yeast book.
and yeah, I mean, I've done it before multiple times. Even it was weird. I'm wondering if the flour I was using was too old. Maybe it was just
Oh,
old.
the I did have a problem with that. I had a bag
Okay.
of flour left over from early pandemic that I used maybe
Hmm.
6 months ago, a year ago, and it turned out really bad. And I think the
Okay.
flour was bunk.
It might be that because it might just be that the
It
flour
sounds ridiculous, but
was
I think
too old.
flour can go bad.
No, I think so. It even has expiration dates on it. I think so. I
Everything's
mean,
got an
yeah,
expiration date on it.
yeah,
I got a bottle of vinegar in my
me
cupboard with
too.
an expiration date on it. I mean, come
Except
on.
honey. Honey
Yeah.
We
apparently never
talked last
goes
time
bad.
how our powdered sugar went bad in our house. Did I talk to
No,
you about
That sounds
this?
familiar.
It tasted like soap. It was absolutely awful.
that's weird.
Yeah, isn't that strange? So things, I guess, eventually can go bad.
I feel like
No.
this is actually, you know how sometimes like you hear about in the movies kids drink their parents' vodka and replace it with water. I feel like this is your kid
Sugar, and
stole
it
a
was
bunch of
just
sugar and replaced it with
uh,
detergent.
uh, you make a
She'll
very,
never know.
very valid point, Ben. I am increasing my list of possible holiday presents right now after everything we just talked about.
do
So
you
I've been documenting that.
do you have a stand mixer, Danielle? Like a
Mhm,
mixer
yeah,
with like bread hooks? Okay.
yeah.
I mean, you don't need it,
I,
but it's much nicer to have that.
I found, I mean, I don't know. I found I do better without it.
Really?
Really?
Yeah, the stretch and fold method. I mean, I use it sometimes, especially for like pizza doughs that I really want to get. You can hammer on them and kick off that gluten formation really quick. But
I would usually make so for almost a year I made 2 loaves of bread every day. Like, and I would give it away. I mean, I didn't,
Yeah.
eat it.
I wouldn't fit.
That would
I
have been
wouldn't fit in
impressive.
frame if I was eating 2 loaves of bread every day. But and I would, often give it away. But I would do the first mix in the stand mixer just because
Hmm.
two like 2 2 pound loaves of bread. They're really big loaves of bread, and so I would do that, and then I would do the stretch and fold for the every like 3 hours or whatever. I would stretch and fold and stretch and fold. Oh,
All right.
slicing! I didn't talk about slicing, but how do you slice your bread, Ben? Like if you make, do you just use a knife or do you have a just rip off
Just
hunks like Danielle just demonstrated animalistically for us?
I have a bucket of butter and I just scoop it out. Um, I I usually use my round Banneton, and I slice in the middle
Okay.
so that I can then push the two unsliced
And you
loaves
just slice with
together.
a knife like as you use it.
I don't have a laser cutter, so
Oh, do you want? I mean, do you want to know what I did?
I
So I
do.
mean,
We do
again,
now.
I made and gave away, bread every single day. I bought a meat slicer, and you just like make it the thickness that you want, and literally you just put it on there like a big old hunk of meat and shunk, 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 and slice the whole thing. And I bought bread bags, and I would double bag them because bread bags are really thin, and I would double bag it, twisty tie it, and give it away. And it was fully sliced
That
and
is so
consistent.
good.
It's
Wow.
such,
If I
oh
had
yeah.
space here for a meat slicer, I would have it mostly so I could buy pepperoni in stick form and get good pepperoni
Yeah, I
slices.
get that. But I mean, I
But
bought it was just an Amazon one for a little over $100, and it's not a great meat slicer, but it worked great for
It's just
bread.
bread. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was shockingly good at slicing a whole loaf of bread. Yeah. No regrets.
No regrets.
No regrets.
So that was what I wanted to. That's how I wanted to outro you here, Shawn. Bare
Yeah.
minimum. Someone wants to get started baking bread. Equipment. What do they need? Go.
Yes.
Need a bowl and flour and yeast and salt and
I
water,
would argue a
assuming.
scale.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
gonna go. I'm gonna go
Oh,
on
that
record as the scale is
okay.
required.
And there's another part of the early book that I kind of glanced over, talking about measuring using volumetric measuring like we do usually in the States here versus by weight. And you definitely make the transition early on to weight. There's just
After
no,
basics, scale comes next.
yeah, I even my
A bowl and
initial
a
like,
scale it would be the top of my list
yeah,
of the things you
yeah,
need.
and flour, you probably want flour. Well, equipment
Yeah.
though. But yeah, they definitely a scale. Don't use the cups and stuff. It just use, use grams and milliliters and yeah.
It's impossible, especially with flour, to consistently scoop a cup of flour. I mean,
Yeah.
I say it's
No matter how much
impossible. Like I'm
you,
saying, it's really hard, but it's actually literally impossible. You will
yeah,
never
because
make
it
two
packs or
scoops
unpacks, or
of
it's,
flour
yeah,
in a
even
cup
if you
the
like
same.
get your cup and like use a butter knife to like get it flat, it's still not the same every time because it packs differently. And so yeah, but and by weight is so much easier.
Hmm.
Like literally I have tubs with my flour, like different kinds of flour, and I have one of those like a scoop. It's just like a scoop, like the 2 scoops of raisins
Raisins.
scoop. Yeah, thank you for knowing exactly what I was going for
Yes,
there. I have
right
just little
there.
metal scoops in there, and when you're doing it, you just have your bowl on there, and tear the scale so it goes to zero, and you just like slowly put it in there until it's the right
Hit your
measurement.
mark.
It's so simple. It's so much easier than trying to
And
use
it can
volumetric
be
stuff.
scaled up and down perfectly,
Yeah,
right?
because it's
You're
just,
like, oh,
yeah.
this makes too big of a loaf of bread. I wish this was 3/4 the size. You just cut all your weight numbers by
Yeah, but
75%.
yeah, instead of like, well, now I need like 1 cup and 3/8 of a cup, or it's
Right.
just, yeah. And like Ben said, though, I mean, even if you do have those measurements, they're not consistent. So yeah, definitely go by weight. I'm glad you brought the what minimum you need. You definitely want a kitchen scale, and it doesn't have to be super expensive either, but something that has a tare
No.
button,
I mean, you
TARE,
can
you know,
buy them
so that,
online for $20.
yeah, or less. Yeah, and it's just
Yeah.
something that you can hit the tear button though, because like you put the flour in, and then hit tear so it goes back to zero. So when you pour the water in, you can measure that separately too. Otherwise, you have to like get another container and measure it in there and then pour it in. But why would you do that when you could just measure everything in one bowl?
How many scales do you own, Shawn?
Just one. It's
How
not
many
even that
scales
great.
do you own, Ben?
Kitchen
I don't know
scales?
why you asked, Danielle. Kitchen scales.
Okay.
I
I
own
think she
two.
asks because that was a weird
One
question
for
to
each
ask.
Dutch oven.
Earlier this year, I bought a second scale. No, my main scale is fairly macro, so I do flour and water in that. But for my salt and yeast measurements, and then sometimes when I'm using other ingredients, I have a little macro scale that'll go down to like hundredths of a gram.
Oh, okay. I'm not that exact. And I just used the big heavy metal bowl on top of the scale, and I tear it to zero, and then I like sprinkle salt in until it's like about the right number of grams.
I ended up with some bread that was way too salty when I did that. I was
Okay.
like, that's it. I'm buying another scale.
All right. My scale is pretty decent, I think. I think it goes like 2/10 of grams.
Oh
So,
yeah, mine doesn't.
okay. So yeah, it
Yeah.
was fine. It wasn't perfect, but it was fine. Gosh, I really want bread now.
I'm having bread for dinner. I
All
am.
right. If you go to the store, get some of that, either like, yeah, the Kerrygold or like the
Mhm.
Vermont cultured butter is good. Usually Amish butter is good, but I mean you got to get like a 2 pound roll of it.
I don't know if
And
I can find. I'll
It
look for
freezes
it.
fine.
yeah, it's not always good. For what it's worth, I've had an Amish roll of butter that I was like, this is got a little disappointing.
It can
So
help if you know where local
yeah.
communities are, and recognize their name on it, because
Yeah,
those will
like if you just
typically be
order
better.
it, like it could be I mean, it could be a guy in New York named, my last name is Amish,
Yeah, I'm
like
Vinny
Frank
Amish, and I
Amish.
make butter.
Yeah,
This is our New York accent portion of the podcast.
yeah.
Oh, good.
I'm
And
walking here.
I'm
And
working.
I'm the only one that's never even been to New York, but all right. Well, it's about that time. Hey,
All
thank you for
right.
talking bread with me. I really want bread. I'm gonna probably make bread soon because I really am hungry for bread. On that note, thanks for tuning in to the Bench I Shirt podcast. This episode of the Bench I Shirt podcast was brought to you by Old Flour. Old Flour. It
Throw it
won't
out
start your
already,
starter.
people.